one of the more important topics in the class. It does come up a lot on the EOC exam. So we're going to stick with this unit all the way through spring break, which means we're going to cover really 8 class periods. And then that 9th class period, which will be the day before spring break, we'll kind of go over some things and just check in before you all head home for 13 days, essentially, which would be nice for all of us. So make sure you have your notebooks out. Gloria, do you have something to write with? Okay, cool. Brian, you're good. All right, let's make sure that we're ready to take some notes. Like I said, this unit is going to be super, super important. It's also going to be a pretty fun unit. Once we get the basics down, we'll start to have the opportunity to talk about some relevant traits, and you all will be able to start to consider what the genetics of your own body are. So I think it'll be fun, but it is something we need to take seriously. So please, please, please make sure you are on your A game when it comes to note taking this unit, when it comes to making sure you're doing all of the assignments between warm-ups and exit tickets and asynchronous assignments, because we need as much practice as possible when it comes with this stuff. Typically, when we're in person, it's a lot easier because we can actually demonstrate on pen and paper. So those of you who are coming in school over the next couple of weeks, I think you all will be in a good place. But those of us who will be at home, which is going to be all of us at some point, we're going to have to be very intentional about using our digital resources to get as much practice as possible. So today we're just going to talk about an intro to genetics. Today is March 19th, 2021. Thank God it's Friday. And it's the first day of our 7th unit. The objective today is to explain the connection between meiosis, protein synthesis, and genetics. And the essential question that we seek to answer: how does genotype affect phenotype? So we see some old vocabulary words here and the objective: meiosis, protein synthesis. But we've also got some new vocabulary words: genetics, genotype, phenotype. We will seek to kind of touch back on all of those words throughout this lesson today. So be ready. Hopefully your hands don't fall off, but I'll take my time and make sure you guys can get down everything you need. Okay, let's jump into it. All right. So genetics is really the study of heredity. And then the question, of course, becomes, well, what is heredity? Heredity is really a word that just talks about inheritance, genetic inheritance, biological inheritance, which is the process by which genetic material is passed on from the parent to the child. Then, of course, we remember from earlier units that a gene is just a section of DNA. So, of course, we've got all this DNA inside of our cells. And within that DNA, we've got about 30 human DNA. We've got about 30,000 different genes. Okay, so a gene is just a small section of DNA. And genes code for proteins. That's super, super important to remember. Genes will code for proteins. Sometimes a gene might only code for one specific protein, sometimes up to maybe 3 or 5. But genes code for protein. All right, let's see if we can get some of these missing or blacked out words figured out. So it says meiosis is the process by which blank are created. What does meiosis create? Does anybody remember? I love that I can see and hear Ardesia flipping her notebook back. That's why we keep notebooks, so that we can refer back to whatever we're writing down. Does anybody remember what is created by meiosis? Not genomes. Every cell typically has a genome. What I'm looking for is a specific cell type, though. What types of cells? They're not actually diploid. They're the opposite of that, which is called a haploid. That I think that word is going to come up later. Sperm cells. Yeah, I think this might be. Let's see. Gametes, right? So, thank you, Brian. So I've always liked to think about meiosis, the E in meiosis standing for egg, and the S in meiosis, one of the S's, standing for sperm cells. So meiosis is needed to create these special types of cells that we call sex cells, but another word for it is called a gamete. Gamete. All right. That's all meiosis does. And I think that either came up in the warm up or the exit ticket. I think I made it as a warm up question. But meiosis, its primary job, its sole job is to create these cells. It does not create blood cells. It does not create nerve cells. We do not use meiosis to replace damaged cells. We only use meiosis to make these sperm and egg cells. What type of reproduction, therefore, are we using meiosis for? Sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction. Good. Because they are sex cells. So we use them for sexual reproduction. A primary purpose of meiosis is to create blank cells. This is the word you were looking for, Ardesia. She said diploid, but really they're called haploid cells because they have half the number of what? Say it a little bit louder. They have half the number of chromosomes. Good, good, good. You're good. I appreciate the participation. Let's keep it up. So please make sure that you're clear on these two sentences. We've got a couple more sentences that we'll kind of work through in the same way, but make sure that you know what these words mean and how meiosis works. Meiosis is the process by which gametes are created to be used for sexual reproduction. A primary purpose of meiosis is to create haploid cells, which have half the number of chromosomes of the body cells. There's a lot of information packed into those two sentences. Okay. Next sentence. Before the chromosomes split during the cell cycle, homologous chromosomes exchange part of their DNA in a process that's called what? When they literally exchange part of their DNA. Yeah, crossing over. Good. As the chromosomes separate during anaphase 2, genes are randomly separated into how many daughter cells? Four. Four daughter cells. So every time a cell undergoes this process of meiosis, we're producing four haploid daughter cells. Okay. One more sentence. The gametes blank contain only one set of chromosomes, which is half of the parent's DNA. Remember, sexual reproduction requires blank to make offspring. Actually, I'm not sure what's behind this box, so let's just check it out. Oh, egg and sperm cells, we knew that already. Remember, sexual reproduction requires blank to make offspring. What process needs to happen to actually make the offspring? And we're seeing it on the screen. Kind of sounds like the stuff that you put in the ground if you're trying to grow plants. What's plant food called? Anybody know that? Plant food, like the stuff, it doesn't smell good. Fertilizer. So this process is called what? Fertilization, yeah. So it's important to just remember, thank you, Brian, that meiosis itself does not lead to offspring. Meiosis is just creating an egg cell or four sperm cells. Meiosis does not actually lead to an offspring. We need fertilization to happen in order to produce an offspring. And this is basically what it looks like. You see the egg cells that are trying to embed themselves inside of that. You see the sperm cells, I'm sorry, that are trying to embed themselves inside of the egg cell. Okay, so meiosis by itself is not sexual reproduction. It just allows for sexual reproduction to take place. It's an important distinction. Okay, so nothing right down here. I'm just briefly going to talk about some of the DNA that's being exchanged. So of course, each of us has 4 grandparents because we each have 2 parents and each of our parents had 2 parents. So our grandparents gave half of their chromosomes, half of their DNA to our parents. Parents' DNA, therefore, was made up of 1/2 of their mom and 1/2 of their dad. The other parent had 1/2 of their mom and 1/2 of their dad. So we can actually track in this image here the different colors that make it a little bit easier to see. Then, of course, half of you is made up of your mom and half of you is made up of your dad. So you end up with this unique random combination of maternal and paternal genes passed down the line. So we're just seeing chromosomes that are being passed on and being inherited. This is why it's possible to literally trace people's family trees back many, many generations, because there will always be that small genetic marker that's available there. Cool to see. Okay, so again, genetics is defined as the study of heredity, aka passing on genes and traits from parents to offspring. Alex, you already got this? One pretty simple way to study and common way to study genetics is to focus on the alleles that each person has. An allele is a copy of a gene, or it's a variation, one of several different variations of a gene. So, for example, the gene that determines our skin color, there are several genes, but for the purpose of this example, the gene that determines our eye color, let's say, has different variations. There are different possibilities. This is why some people have really, really dark brown eyes. Some people have hazel brown eyes. Some people have blue eyes. Some people have green eyes. So these are all determined by the same gene. They're all determined by the gene for eye color, but there are different possibilities, different variations. We call those variations alleles. It's a weird word to say. Allele, allele. And this is important to write down. It's highlighted in green on your screen. Typically, we do represent alleles with letters. We'll talk more about that. We represent alleles with letters. Good to go? We use 2 letters. If there is a capital letter, it's referring to the dominant allele. The dominant allele is stronger than the recessive allele, which means that if the person has a dominant allele, they will have the dominant trait. So if I go back to the last slide really quickly, oops. We see these different traits on the bottom right side of the screen. We've got hair color, blood type, eye color, growth, all these different traits. Typically, there's one dominant version of the trait, and there's one recessive version of the trait. In order for a person to end up with the dominant version of that trait, they must have a dominant allele present. Only one. They only need one dominant allele. Because the dominant allele is stronger, it only takes one, as we're going to see soon. In order to have the recessive version of the trait, a person needs to have 2 recessive alleles, and we represent the recessive allele with lowercase letters. The dominant allele is represented by a capital letter. The recessive allele is represented by the lowercase letters. All right, I'm going to erase this on the screen. Anybody need to see this anymore? Okay, so again, the dominant traits are represented by capital letters. In this case, we see we've got the example at the bottom of the letter B. So dominant will be capital B. I'm going to use, do I have a blue marker? Yeah. Let's see. It's kind of small, right? Can you all? They probably can't even see that. Can you see that on your screen? And recessive is the lower case B. And I do want you to, I promise you, if you write down this chart, if you write down this chart, it'll go a long way for you. I promise you. So I would definitely encourage you to write what I'm writing. We're going to have 5 rows. So I've still got some more to write at the bottom. So the dominant allele is represented by a capital letter. The recessive allele is represented by a lowercase letter. I do encourage you to write this chart down. I'm going to go to the next slide, though. Okay. Now, of course, we are getting genetic information from both of our parents, from 2 people, which means that for every single trait, we're getting 2 copies of the same gene. For the gene that controls our eye color, I'm getting 1 copy from my dad, and I'm getting 1 copy from my mom. For the gene that controls my hair texture, I'm getting 1 copy from my dad, I'm getting 1 copy from my mom. So for every single gene, I'm getting 2 possible, or I'm getting two alleles. Those alleles combine to determine what my actual trait will be. So there are 3 possible combinations. I could end up with 2 dominant alleles. We call that homozygous dominant. And as it says on your screen right now, the prefix homo, H-O-M-O, means same. So homozygous dominant means I have 2 of the same allele and they are both dominant. 2 of the same alleles and they are both dominant. That's what homozygous dominant means. So in our example, we're working with the letter B. Homozygous dominant would mean 2 of the same alleles and they're both dominant, so they're both capital. So I've got 2 capital Bs. Same thing applies to homozygous recessive. Homo is a prefix that means same. Homozygous recessive means I have two of the same alleles, but this time they are recessive, so they're the lowercase letters. So in our example, when we're working with the letter B, what we're talking about is I've got two recessive alleles, two lowercase b's. That means that both of my parents gave me a recessive allele. I got one recessive allele from my dad, one recessive allele from my mom. Synonym for homozygous is true breeding. True breeding is also, it also means homozygous, or it could also mean purebred. That just means that you only have one type of allele. You either have two dominant alleles or you have two recessive alleles. That's what we mean when we say true breeding. But of course, the third possible combination is that I get one dominant allele from one parent and the other parent gives me a recessive allele. So the alleles are different. One is dominant and one is recessive. The prefix that means different is hetero. So this term heterozygous means I've got one dominant allele and one recessive allele. In this case, with our example, that means one capital B and one lowercase b. All right. So let's just think of a trait. We've got some examples that will come up, but I'm thinking of the trait for attached earlobes. So some of you, Ayana's looking at me like I'm crazy. Some of you, if you feel your ears, you'll know that you'll realize that your earlobe is actually attached to the side of your face. Some of us have dangling earlobes. We call that detached earlobes. All right. So if your earlobe dangles, it's not actually attached to the side of your face. It's called detached. Let me see. Hold on one second. Okay. So detached earlobes, like the ones that dangle, are the dominant trait. Detached earlobes are the dominant trait. What that means is that having attached earlobes must be the what trait? Good. Attached must be recessive. All right. So this is why we use keys, right? And you guys are going to get some practice with this starting on Monday. The dominant trait is detached earlobes. The recessive trait is attached earlobes. So if I've got homozygous dominant, meaning I've got two dominant alleles. Do I have detached earlobes or do I have attached earlobes? What'd you say? If I've got two dominant, I need to have I've got two capital B. A capital B gives me detached earlobes. And the phrasing we would use here is that dominant, detached is dominant to attached or attached. I'm trying to enunciate so you guys can hear the difference. Detached is dominant to attached. Or we can say it the other way around. Attached is recessive to detached. All right. So what if I have attached earlobes? What is my combination of alleles in that case? If I've got attached earlobes, you got to be homorecessive. Good. Because attached or attached is a recessive trait. So I need to be homozygous recessive. Let me say that in the microphone. Attached, as we've already determined, is the recessive trait. So in order to have the recessive trait, I need to be homozygous recessive. Now, the confusing one, the one that can be a little confusing, is heterozygous. Heterozygous, hetero means different. So I've got two different alleles. In this case, I'm capital B and I'm lowercase b. I got one dominant allele from one parent and the other parent gave me one recessive allele. So this might be confusing, but what do we think I'm going to be if I'm heterozygous? Will I have detached earlobes or attached earlobes? One is going to be detached and one's going to be attached. What do you think, Brian? Why do you say attached? Let me go back. You said what? Detached. Let me go back. One slide. What does that middle sentence say? Dominant is what? Dominant is stronger. That's why we call it dominant. It's always going to dominate the recessive allele. That means that if I've got one of each, which one gets priority? Yes, the dominant trait is going to get the priority. So in this case, I've got one of each, but I don't even really care about this recessive because there's a dominant allele present. So I'm going to get the dominant trait, which in this case is detached. Does that make sense? Okay, we'll get a lot of practice with that. So if it's still unclear, if we're still unclear, don't worry. I wanted to jump right into this because we are going to need a lot of practice with it. So I didn't want to waste time. All right, let's practice now. We can see we've got some different allele combinations. Okay, Rudy, have a good weekend if you're about to jump off. We can see we've got some different allele combinations here. Of course, you get two alleles, one from each parent. I want you guys to tell me if what we're looking at is homozygous dominant, and you can just say HD, especially if you're typing into the chat. Just do HD for homozygous dominant, type or say HR for homozygous recessive, and then you can type or say HE for heterozygous. So what are we looking at here? AA, two capital A's. What would that be? That's HD. Can you explain that really quickly, Brian? It's two capital letters, and a capital letter is what kind of allele? A capital letter represents the dominant alleles. So if I've got two of the same alleles, that's homozygous. And in this case, I've got two capital alleles, so it's homozygous dominant, HD. All right, capital C, lowercase c, what's that? that is heterozygous. Good. Hetero is a prefix meaning different. So these alleles are different. There's one that's capital, there's one that's lowercase. Okay, lowercase f, lowercase f. What's that? That's homorecessive. Lowercase, lowercase. So they're the same thing. They're both the same size, and they're both lowercase. So that means that they're recessive. So homo recessive, HR. Okay, what about that next one? Capital E, lowercase e. It's got to be heterozygous. Remember, homo means same. Are these the same? No, they're different. So when we see that they are different, it's got to be hetero. One of the different with different sizes. One is dominant, one is allele. Or I'm sorry, one is dominant, one is recessive. So they're different. So that in this case means that they are heterozygous. Hetero is a prefix meaning different. All right, capital B, lowercase b. What's that? That's also heterozygous. How do you feel about this, Ayana? Okay. Do you have any questions? What's your confusion? I feel like you're just a little confused. You're right about that. Okay. So I want you to literally look at the letters for this next example. Are they the same or are they different? They're the same. Which prefix means same? Homo means same. Good. So we can rule out heterozygous now. We know it's either HD for homozygous dominant or it's HR for homozygous recessive. Which one is it going to be? It's HD. Why? Wonderful. Wonderful. So we see that they're the same, and we can also see that they are capital letters. So that means that it's got to be dominant, homozygous dominant. Good job. Okay, what about the next one? Gloria, do you think you could do this next one? Why not? What questions do you have? Are you on your phone? Okay. So look at the letters. Do you see them? G G. Are they the same or are they different? They're different. Which prefix means different? Homo or hetero? Well, I can't tell you what you're saying actually. No, not homo. So let's go back for a second. Way, way back. Did you write this down? So guys, make those of you at home, make sure you're writing down anything that you see that's highlighted. I'm strategic with it. I also want you to write down this chart. Please make sure you write down the chart. I'm taking my time so that you guys have the opportunity to do that. Let's try another one. So you tell me, actually, let's do another example, that the one we weren't just working on. So look, we're looking at FF now. Can you see it? Are they same or are they different? Would you say are they the same or different? They're the same. So homo. So we can rule this. We know we're not talking about hetero. Now the question is homozygous dominant or is it homozygous recessive? Which one is it? What do you think? How do you know? Because what? Because they're lowercase. Yeah. So that means that recessive is represented by the lowercase letters. All right. So that one is indeed HR for homozygous recessive. Let's go back to the one you were working on earlier. These letters. So what's the this is the okay, Alex, you're up. Last one. Same or different? What'd you say? No. Are they the same or are they different? Look at this. These are the same thing. They're the same. This. So what I mean is like there's one capital and there's one lowercase. So they're both lowercase. Same thing. HR is correct. Let me just find out. So I know you got it. So it can be said. Alex was telling me here that these are two lowercase letters, which means that they are the same. That means that we're looking for the prefix homo. We can rule out heterozygous. It can't be heterozygous. Hetero means different. So we can rule that out. Now we want to know, is it homo dominant or is it homo recessive? Alex was able to tell me because they are lowercase letters, that means I have a recessive allele. The recessive allele is always going to be indicated by the lowercase letters. All right, so that's HR in this case. Good job. This is not easy when we're first exposed to it. We're doing well with it. We're going to get a lot more practice, but everybody who's here in person definitely helped out. All right, we've got a couple more concepts to talk about today. So there are really two ways to describe traits. We can describe them using what's called a genotype, and I see some highlighted words here. So for my people who are hesitant to write stuff down, this is your clue to write it down. For genotype, that's the description of the genes. It's the description of the alleles that are present. So this is how we use letters to describe a trait, because those letters represent alleles. The other way that we can describe traits is by describing the phenotype. The phenotype is the physical description of the trait. So that might be tall, it could be blue, it could be brown, it could be heavy, or in our example, the phenotypes we were talking about were detached earlobes or attached earlobes. That's a physical characteristic. We're describing the physical characteristic of the trait. The genotype, on the other hand, is the genetic characteristic. So what we talked about was that to have detached earlobes, I could have capital B, that's homozygous dominant. That's describing a genotype, capital B. Or I could have capital B, lowercase b. That's describing heterozygous. That's also a genotype because I'm using letters. The phenotype of that is detached earlobes. The other phenotype was attached earlobes, which would be genotypically lowercase b. The genotype is homozygous recessive. Okay, so genotype uses letters and these phrases: heterozygous, homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive. Phenotype uses an actual visible characteristic that you can see with your eyes. Okay. Are we clear on that? And I like to think about the PH in phenotype stands for physical description. pH and phenotype, pH and physical. Okay. Here's some other ways that we can visualize it. Genotype actually takes a look at your DNA. It tells us, we're using the phrases heterozygous, homozygous, blah, blah, blah. Phenotype is actually what can I see? What traits and characteristics can I see? We'll talk more about this concept, nothing to write down here right now. Not all of our traits are as simple as you get one dominant, you get one recessive, that's it. Many of our traits are actually controlled by multiple genes, and this is how we end up with what's called a gradient of outcomes. Of course, not every human being is tall and short. Not every human being is 7 feet tall or 5 feet tall. We've got people who are every height in between. Not every human being is exactly black and exactly white. We've got every different intonation in between, every tone in between. That's because there are multiple genes that are controlling for these traits. Hair color, you might have, those of you who like to do hair, you might have heard of different hair textures. You could be 3C, you could be 2C, you could be 2B, as I understand it. I don't really know everything about that, but you can have these different outcomes because it's controlled by multiple genes. This word here, polygenic, that means multiple. Poly means multiple. Genic means genes. Polygenic traits means multiple genes. So it's not as simple as we like to make it. All right, so let's see. Are we talking about a genotype or a phenotype? So when I say curly hair, which one would that be? That's a phenotype. That's a physical characteristic that I can see with my eyes. When I say capital A, lowercase a, phenotype, good job. Thank you, Brian. And tell me, Brian, would that be HD, HR, or HE? Excellent. That's hetero. That's HE. How did you know that? How did you know that? Because they're different sizes. Good. Greenish brown, what would that be? That's a phenotype. I can literally see that. For example, if this was describing the skin color of a specific fish or a reptile, I could actually see that with my eyes. That's a physical characteristic. It's a phenotype. Okay, XY, what's that? That's genotype. Now, you might be looking at this like, wait a minute, there are two totally different letters there. They're both capitals. We'll talk more about that. It will make more sense. This process gets complicated. That's why I want you guys to take notes all along the way. Question? With what? Genes? Oh, yeah, that's what we're talking about. Yeah. Go ahead. Say it. Okay, I see what you're saying. Hey, that's a great question. Now, these two are connected, right? So I can describe my eye color phenotypically by saying I have brown eyes. That's the phenotype. I could also describe that same eye color genotypically by saying, oh, my genotype is homozygous dominant, right? So we can describe the exact same trait in two different ways. I can describe it with the phenotype or with the genotype. Does that make sense? So in this example we were talking about, my phenotype could be either D type or A type. That's my phenotype. I can see that with my eyes. I can see my ears, right? But my genotype could also describe that same trait. Homozygous dominant is just another way of saying detached. They're describing the same thing, though. Does this make sense? Okay, that was a good question. Thank you for asking that. Okay, so XY, we're using letters there, so that's a genotype. We will talk about why we have two different letters next week. And then the last one, spotted, what would that be? Yeah, that's a phenotype. Good. Okay, so let's put it all together. At the top, it tells us that purple, whatever this is, let's think about maybe flower color. Purple flowers are dominant to white flowers. So what is my dominant allele? Purple is my dominant allele, or it's my dominant trait, I should say. That's why it says purple is dominant to. We could also go reverse and say white is blank to what? If purple is dominant, then white is recessive, right? So purple is dominant to white. White is recessive to purple. That's the same thing, same relationship. That's like saying Shaquille O'Neal is taller than Mr. Rudd. Mr. Rudd is shorter than Shaquille O'Neal. It's the same thing. What'd you say? It should be. um, okay, so purple is dominant to white. So of course, my dominant allele is always represented by the capital letters. In this case, a capital P represents purple. And the recessive alleles is always represented by the lowercase letter. So in this case, it's a lowercase letter P. Okay, so number one, I've got capital P, capital P. I want to know what trait that gives me. Does that give me purple or white? That gives me purple because what is this called? So two capital P's, capital P, capital P. That is homozygous dominant. So it gives me the dominant trait, which we just discussed is purple. What about number two, capital P, lowercase p? That also gives me purple, but that's a little bit confusing. Why does that give me purple? Breon is explaining it to us. He's saying, yes, they are different. I've got one capital P and I've got one lowercase p, which means that it's called what when it's different? It's called hetero. Yeah, when it's different, it's called heterozygous. That's the genotype. But anytime I have a dominant allele present, it doesn't matter if I have two dominant alleles, which would be capital P, or if I only have one dominant allele, which is capital P, lowercase p, that dominant allele is strong. So it's going to determine what the outcome will be. So in this case, I have one capital P, one dominant allele, and so it still gives me the dominant trait. Anytime I see a dominant allele present, I end up with the dominant trait. Okay, anytime. Oh, I kind of went backwards. Sorry. Excuse me. And then in order to have the recessive trait, I need to have two recessive alleles. Okay, at the bottom, we've got another example. Light hair is recessive to dark hair. So which is the first, we're given the phenotypes this time, dark, dark, light. Which should the first genotype be? They already gave us that. Oh, that's the phenotype. Remember, genotypes always have two letters. You get one from each parent. Oh, okay. We can, and the letter doesn't matter for real, but that was a good question. I don't know what it's going to be, but let's use D. Two capital D's. Good. Oh, I'm sorry. They're telling us we're using H's. So two capital H's. Two capital H's for hair, I guess. The letter is totally arbitrary, guys. The letters don't really matter. All right. So I believe the next one is going to be number 3. For number 3. For the light hair. What'd you say? Two lowercase h's. Oh, I don't know which order it's going in. Sorry. Okay, let's just talk about it. I didn't know which order it was going to reveal itself. Two capital H's. Ardesia told us that was going to be dark hair. Actually, we were given that it was dark hair. Ardesia told us it would be two capital H's. That's called homozygous dominant. But there's another way to get dark hair. There will always be two ways to get the dominant trait. We could be homozygous dominant, or we could also be heterozygous. Both of those will give me the dominant trait. The only way to get the recessive trait, which in this case is light hair, that's why it says light hair is recessive to dark hair. The only way to get the recessive trait is if I am homozygous recessive. That's it. Because anytime there's a dominant allele present, I'm going to have the dominant trait. So in this case, I don't want any dominant alleles present. I just want to be homozygous recessive. That gives me the recessive trait. All right, a lot of phrases were just tossed out. We've got 10 minutes left, and we do have an assignment on Canvas. The assignment is going to be really, really helpful to you all. I want you to jump in and knock it out in the time that you're being given. 10 minutes probably will be enough, but if not, then you guys have Hawk time coming up. You can knock it out during Hawk time. All of the questions have explanations if you get them wrong. My advice is if you get a question wrong, you should write it down. That's how you learn from it, okay? Or write down the explanation that you're given as well. The assignment is called U7D1 Basic Genetics Practice. I'll be on mute. Kathy, I'm going to send you a link where you and I can talk after class. right, folks, have a great weekend. Excellent job today, especially to my people in person. Good job. Rotation B. I'm expecting big things from you guys now. Folks at home, enjoy yourself. Have a smooth day. Talk to you guys soon. Kathy, I'm about to jump on that call as soon as I hop off of this one. See ya. Peace out.